Pay attention to what you're about to see. This footage was captured by urban explorer Marcus Chen in March 2019, deep inside an abandoned Cold War bunker system beneath the streets of Portland, Oregon. Watch carefully as his flashlight sweeps across the concrete corridor. See those wooden crates stacked against the wall? Notice the symbols painted on them. Faded, weathered, but unmistakable. Now watch as Marcus approaches closer. His camera shakes. He's breathing harder. Because what he's about to discover inside those sealed containers will unravel one of the most twisted criminal conspiracies in American history. A case that law enforcement thought had gone cold 15 years earlier. 23 victims, 3 continents, and a killer who used the past to hide his present. You know that feeling when you stumble across something in your attic that doesn't belong? Maybe an old photograph you don't recognize, or a key that doesn't fit any lock in your house? For Marcus Chen, a 28-year-old software developer with a passion for urban exploration, that feeling hit him like a freight train on a cold March afternoon in 2019. Marcus had spent months researching the abandoned military infrastructure beneath Portland. The city sits on a network of tunnels and bunkers built during the Cold War era, most of them sealed off and forgotten. But Marcus had obtained permits, legitimate ones, mind you, to explore and document these spaces for a historical preservation project. He'd been in dozens of these locations before. Empty rooms, rusted equipment, nothing that couldn't be explained away as remnants of a paranoid age. But this particular bunker complex was different. The entrance was hidden beneath an old industrial building in northwest Portland, one that had been scheduled for demolition. Marcus had maybe a week before the wrecking balls would erase this piece of history forever. He descended the metal ladder with his camera, his headlamp, and that mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes with entering a space where no one's been for decades. The first few rooms were exactly what he expected. Concrete walls, military-issue furniture rotting away, pipes dripping condensation. Then he turned down a corridor that seemed to stretch into absolute darkness, and that's when he saw them. 12 wooden crates, stacked deliberately. Each one about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and painted on every visible surface were symbols that made Marcus's blood run cold. Not because he was a history buff, but because these symbols had no business being in an American military facility. Let me paint you a picture of what went through Marcus's mind in that moment. He's standing alone, 50 feet underground, staring at what looks like Nazi memorabilia in a bunker that should contain nothing but American Cold War relics. His first thought? This has to be some kind of military trophy, captured materials, war souvenirs. But then he noticed the locks, heavy, modern padlocks, not vintage, not rusted, recent. Someone had been here, someone had sealed these crates with care, and that's when Marcus made the decision that would blow open a case that investigators had given up on years before. He called the police. Detective Sarah Morrison had been with the Portland Police Bureau for 16 years, and she'd seen her share of weird calls. But Nazi crates in an abandoned bunker wasn't even on her bingo card for strange discoveries. When she arrived at the industrial building with her partner, Detective James Park, and a team from the Bureau's Major Crimes Unit, she honestly expected to find some urban explorer who'd let his imagination run wild with some old military surplus. The descent into the bunker changed her mind real quick. "The smell hit us first," Sarah would later testify. "Even before we reached the corridor where the crates were stored. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, subtle, chemical, like formaldehyde mixed with something earthier. I've worked enough homicide cases to know what decomposition smells like, even when someone's tried to mask it." The forensics team suited up. They documented everything: the symbols on the crates, the positioning, the locks, even the dust patterns on the floor that showed someone had walked this path recently. Then came the moment everyone was both dreading and anticipating. They cut the first lock. The lid came off with a creak that echoed through the corridor. What they found inside defied immediate comprehension. Bodies, multiple bodies, wrapped in thick plastic sheeting, then wrapped again in what appeared to be vintage military blankets. Each one had been treated with chemical preservatives. That explained the smell. And attached to each victim was a small metal tag, the kind you might see in a museum exhibit, bearing a name, a date of death, and a location. But here's what made it even more horrific. The forensic pathologist who examined the first body on site noticed something the others would miss until the full autopsy. The plastic sheeting had been sealed while the victim was still breathing. Tiny perforations in the material near the face, made from the inside. Fingernail marks on the inner layer of plastic. These people had been buried alive in preservation fluid, then sealed in crates and left to die in the dark. The first crate contained 3 victims. The second contained 2. By the time they'd opened all 12 crates, the count stood at 23 bodies in various states of mummification. 23 human beings, ranging in age from 19 to 72, who had been methodically murdered and preserved like specimens in some twisted collection. Detective Morrison organized the most massive crime scene operation Portland had seen in decades. The bunker was sealed off as federal investigators joined the case. The FBI's evidence response team, the Department of Justice, even representatives from Interpol, because some of those metal tags indicated the victims had come from overseas. The tags themselves told a story that didn't make sense. Not yet. The oldest tag was dated September 2003. The newest was dated January 2019, just 2 months before Marcus Chen's discovery. 16 years of killing, all ending up in this forgotten space beneath the city. Now here's the thing about cold cases and missing persons investigations. They're messy. People disappear for 1,000 different reasons, and not all of them involve foul play. Adults have the right to vanish if they want to, but when you suddenly have 23 bodies with names and dates attached, you can start connecting dots that were invisible before. The task force assembled by the FBI began running the names on those tags through national databases. VICAP, NCIC, NamUs. And that's when the case took its first major turn. 8 of the victims had been reported missing between 2003 and 2019, but not from Portland. From cities scattered across the country, Seattle, San Francisco, Phoenix, Denver, even as far as Boston and Miami. They were immigrants mostly, people who'd come to the United States seeking asylum, seeking safety from persecution in their home countries. The kind of people who might not have extensive family networks to notice immediately when they disappeared. The kind of people who might slip through the cracks. The other 15 victims? No missing persons reports at all, which meant either no one had reported them missing, or they'd been reported under different names than what appeared on the tags. Detective Morrison's team began the painstaking work of identifying the bodies through DNA, dental records, and facial reconstruction where possible. It was going to take months, but while that scientific work proceeded, another investigator on the task force noticed something that would crack the case wide open. His name was Agent David Kowalski, and he'd been with the FBI's art crime team for 12 years before transferring to violent crimes. He knew his history, and when he examined the symbols painted on those crates, really examined them, photographed them, enhanced the details, he realized something everyone else had missed. They weren't authentic. The symbols were painted in the style of World War II Nazi markings, sure, but the paint was modern acrylic. The wear patterns were artificially created. Someone had gone to great lengths to make these crates look like historical artifacts, but they'd been constructed within the last 20 years. This wasn't about ideology, Agent Kowalski explained to the task force. This was about cover. Someone wanted these crates to look like they'd been hidden away since 1945, like they were some kind of war criminal's time capsule. But they're props. Elaborate, detailed props. So what was the real story? What were these crates actually hiding? The answer came from the most unexpected source, a banker in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His name was Ricardo Vega, and he'd been following the news coverage of the Portland bunker discovery with intense interest. Because 15 years earlier, in 2004, his sister had disappeared while traveling through the United States on what was supposed to be a cultural exchange program. Her name was Isabella Vega, and she was 23 years old when she vanished after arriving in Seattle. Ricardo had spent years searching for answers. He'd hired private investigators. He'd pressured the American Embassy in Argentina. He'd posted on every missing persons forum he could find. Nothing. It was like Isabella had simply ceased to exist after clearing customs at SeaTac International Airport. But when the FBI released the names from the metal tags, trying to identify the victims, Ricardo saw his sister's name, Isabella Maria Vega. Date of death, October 2004. Location, Seattle, Washington. He caught the next flight to Portland. The DNA confirmed it. Victim number 7 was Isabella Vega. And with that confirmation came Ricardo's testimony about what his sister had been doing in the United States, which would provide the first real clue to the killer's motive. Isabella hadn't just been on a cultural exchange. She'd been recruited by an organization called Heritage Foundation International, a nonprofit that claimed to help immigrants and refugees resettle in America, particularly those fleeing political persecution. The organization had a compelling pitch. They would handle all the paperwork, connect immigrants with job opportunities, even provide temporary housing while people got established. For someone like Isabella, whose family had survived political upheaval in Argentina and who wanted to help others in similar situations, it seemed like perfect fit. She'd signed up to work as a volunteer coordinator, helping process applications from asylum seekers across Latin America. But here's what haunted everyone when Ricardo shared this information. Heritage Foundation International had shut down in 2006, just 2 years after Isabella's disappearance. The founder had cited financial difficulties and moved on to other ventures. The organization's records? Destroyed in what was ruled an accidental warehouse fire. Convenient, right? The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit started digging into Heritage Foundation International's history. What they found was a paper trail that led through shell companies, offshore accounts, and deliberately convoluted corporate structures clearly designed to hide something. And at the center of it all was a man named Thomas Brener. Thomas Brener was 63 years old in 2019, a seemingly respectable businessman who'd made his fortune in real estate development and property management. He owned buildings across the Pacific Northwest, including, and this is where it gets interesting, the industrial property that housed the entrance to the bunker where the bodies were found. Brener had founded Heritage Foundation International in 2002. On paper, it was a humanitarian effort. In practice, the FBI was starting to suspect it had been something far more sinister. But suspicion isn't evidence. The task force needed to build a case that would stand up in court. They needed to connect Thomas Brener directly to those 23 bodies sealed in crates beneath Portland. They needed to understand why. The forensic accountants found the first piece. Heritage Foundation International had received government grants totaling over $8 million between 2002 and 2006, money earmarked for immigrant resettlement services. But when auditors examined how that money had been spent, they found massive discrepancies, payments to non-existent contractors, invoices for services never rendered. The money had been systematically looted, with at least $5 million ending up in accounts controlled by Thomas Brener. It was fraud on a grand scale. But here's the twist that made this case truly horrific. When you run a nonprofit serving vulnerable immigrants, you create records, applications, intake forms, personal information about people who are often undocumented, afraid of authorities, desperate for help. People who might not be immediately missed if they disappeared. The FBI's theory started taking shape. Thomas Brener had used Heritage Foundation International as a hunting ground. He'd identified the most vulnerable applicants, people with no family in the country, no legal status, no support network, and he'd made them disappear. But why preserve the bodies? Why go through the elaborate charade with the Nazi-marked crates? That answer came from the Department of Justice's investigation into another one of Brener's business ventures. One he'd operated very quietly through a separate set of shell companies. Thomas Brener had been running an underground adoption network. Let me explain how this worked because it's almost too twisted to believe. Brener would identify young immigrants who came through Heritage Foundation International, particularly women of childbearing age. He would offer them jobs, housing, support. Then, once he had them isolated and dependent on him, he would force them into surrogacy arrangements. These women would be impregnated, sometimes through assault, sometimes through coerced artificial insemination, and then confined until they gave birth. The babies would be sold through illegal adoption channels to wealthy clients willing to pay extraordinary sums for a child with no paper trail. The mothers, they became liabilities, and liabilities had to be eliminated. The chemical preservation wasn't about respect or memorialization. It was about creating insurance. If Brener's adoption network was ever exposed, if anyone ever came looking for the birth mothers, he could produce bodies that appeared to have died decades earlier, victims of some historical tragedy, maybe connected to war crimes or refugee crises. The Nazi symbolism was misdirection, designed to make investigators look backward into history instead of at present-day crimes. It was a plan that had worked for 16 years. 23 women had died in Brener's custody, their babies sold, their identities erased, their bodies hidden away like artifacts from a different era. But now the walls were closing in. The investigation into Thomas Brener's criminal enterprise became one of the most complex cases the FBI had handled in years. You're not just looking at murder, you're looking at human trafficking, fraud, illegal adoption, assault, conspiracy, layers upon layers of criminality that had been carefully constructed over nearly 2 decades. Detective Morrison and Agent Kowalski led different aspects of the investigation, and what they uncovered painted a picture of a man who'd been planning this from the very beginning. Thomas Brener wasn't just some opportunistic criminal. He was methodical, patient, intelligent in the worst possible way. Born in 1956 in Eugene, Oregon, Brener had grown up in comfortable middle-class surroundings. His father owned a construction company. His mother taught elementary school. By all accounts, it was a normal childhood. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong in Thomas Brener's moral wiring. He'd studied business at the University of Oregon, graduated in 1978, and spent the next 2 decades building a property management empire. He married twice, divorced twice, had no children of his own, a fact that would become relevant as the investigation progressed. Here's what the psychological profile suggested. Brener had developed an obsession with legacy and control. He couldn't have biological children due to a medical condition diagnosed in his 30s. But more than that, he'd become fixated on the idea of creating something that would outlast him. Something hidden, something secret, something that proved he had power over life and death itself. The Heritage Foundation International was established in 2002, right after Brener's second divorce. The timing wasn't coincidental. He'd lost his marriage, he was approaching retirement age, and he was looking for a new project, something that would give him purpose. But why target vulnerable immigrants? Why choose this particular victim pool? The answer was as cold and pragmatic as everything else about Brener. These were people who existed in the shadows of society, people who were afraid to contact authorities, people whose disappearances might be attributed to deportation, voluntary departure, or simply the chaos of undocumented life in America. In other words, perfect victims. The FBI's investigation revealed that Brener had established a network of accomplices. He didn't work alone. He couldn't have. There was Dr. Martin Cross, a disbarred physician who'd lost his medical license in 1998 for prescribing unnecessary medications. Cross had become Brener's medical accomplice, handling the artificial inseminations, the prenatal care, and eventually the murders. The autopsies on the victims revealed they'd all been killed with lethal injections of potassium chloride, a method that requires medical knowledge. Then there was Jennifer Walsh, who'd worked as an administrator for Heritage Foundation International. Walsh had been responsible for identifying potential victims from the intake applications. She'd flag women who fit Brener's criteria: young, healthy, isolated, desperate. Walsh would later claim she didn't know what Brener was doing with these women, But the paper trail told a different story. She'd been paid substantial bonuses every time one of the flagged applicants left the program. And there was Marcus Dietrich, a contractor who'd helped Brener maintain the bunker facility and construct the preservation system. Dietrich had military experience. He'd served in the army during the First Gulf War and had training in chemical decontamination. He knew how to work with preservatives, how to seal spaces, how to create an environment where organic materials wouldn't decay. These three. Accomplices gave investigators leverage, because when you're facing life in prison for multiple murders, suddenly cooperation starts looking appealing. Dr. Cross broke first. In exchange for testimony against Brener, Cross detailed the entire operation, how Brener had recruited him in 2003, offering substantial payment for medical services, no questions asked. How the first victim, a woman named Rosa Martinez from El Salvador, had been brought to a property Brener owned in rural Washington state. How she'd been confined there for months, impregnated through artificial insemination, and held until she gave birth. Thomas wanted everything controlled, Cross told investigators. The genetics, the timing, the outcome. He had clients lined up, wealthy couples who couldn't adopt through legal channels or didn't want to deal with the scrutiny. Some of them had been denied adoption for cause. Criminal records, abuse allegations, you name it. Thomas didn't care. Money was money. After each birth, the baby would be delivered to the client through an elaborate handoff system. The new parents would be provided with forged birth certificates listing them as the biological parents. The babies would get social security numbers, legitimate identities. No one would ever know they'd been obtained through illegal means. And the birth mothers? Cross described the procedure with clinical detachment. Potassium chloride injection, administered within days of giving birth. Death came within minutes. Then the bodies would be transported to the bunker, treated with preservatives, wrapped, tagged with false information, and sealed in the crates. Why the Nazi symbols? Agent Kowalski asked during the interrogation. Cross shrugged. Thomas had this theory. He said if anyone ever found the bodies, he wanted them to think it was some old war crime, something historical. He studied everything about that era. How bodies were preserved in concentration camps, how victims were processed, documented. He wanted to create something that would send investigators looking in the wrong direction. He figured if people thought these were victims from the 1940s, they'd never connect them to missing immigrants from the 2000s. It was misdirection on a scale that was almost ingenious if it hadn't been so utterly evil. Jennifer Walsh's testimony provided additional details about the victim selection process. She described how Brener had specific criteria. Women between 20 and 35, no immediate family in the United States, no legal immigration status, preferably no English language skills. The more isolated and vulnerable, the better. He called them ghosts, Walsh said, her voice barely above a whisper during her deposition. That's what Thomas called them. Ghosts, people who were already invisible to society. He said no one would miss them, and he was mostly right. Most of these women, their families back home, thought they'd just moved on, started new lives. They never reported them missing because they figured, that's just how it goes sometimes when people immigrate. Marcus Dietrich's confession filled in the final pieces. He described building the preservation system in the bunker, creating an environment with controlled temperature and humidity. He'd installed the shelving for the crates, helped transport the bodies, even helped paint the Nazi symbols according to Brener's exacting specifications. I knew what we were doing was wrong, Dietrich admitted. But Thomas, he had a way of making it seem justified. He'd say we were giving these babies better lives, rescuing them from poverty and uncertainty. He'd say the mothers were making the ultimate sacrifice. He made it sound almost noble. And the money, he paid me more than I'd ever made in construction. I told myself I was just building things, just moving boxes. I didn't let myself think too hard about what was inside. With testimony from 3 accomplices, the FBI had built a comprehensive case against Thomas Brener. But there was one problem. They couldn't find him. When the first news reports about the bunker discovery hit the media, Brener had been in Portland, living in a luxury condo downtown. But within 24 hours of Marcus Chen's initial 911 call, Brener had vanished. His condo was empty. His bank accounts had been drained. His cell phone went dark. Security footage from Portland International Airport showed him boarding a flight to Mexico City on the evening of the bunker discovery, before police had even opened the first crate. Someone had tipped him off. But who? The investigation revealed that Brener had maintained a police scanner in his condo, monitored news feeds obsessively, and had a go-bag prepared for years. He'd always known this day might come. He'd planned for it. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt that quickly went international. Interpol was notified. Border Patrol agencies across Latin America were alerted. But Brener had a 16-year head start in planning his escape, and he'd done it well. Meanwhile, the task force continued the grim work of identifying victims and notifying families. Ricardo Vega wasn't the only family member who'd been searching for answers. There was Maria Santos, whose daughter Carmen had disappeared in 2006 after accepting a job offer from Heritage Foundation International. There was Lynn Chen, who'd lost contact with her sister May in 2008. There was Alejandro Rodriguez, whose wife Sofia had vanished in 2012, leaving him with a 6-year-old son and no explanation. Each family had spent years in agonizing uncertainty. Each had filed missing persons reports that went nowhere. Each had been told that their loved one had probably just moved on, started over somewhere else. After all, that's what immigrants do sometimes, right? They disappear into the vastness of America, but these families had never stopped looking. And now they had answers. Terrible, heartbreaking answers, but answers nonetheless. The victim identification process took 4 months. By July 2019, all 23 bodies had been positively identified through DNA analysis and matched to missing persons reports or to family members who came forward after the media coverage. The victims came from 8 different countries: El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, Brazil, and the Philippines. They ranged in age from 19 to 72, though the older victims, forensics determined, had been killed for different reasons. They'd been witnesses, people who'd seen too much and had to be silenced. Each victim's story was unique, but they all shared common threads: vulnerability, hope, desperation for a better life. Brener had exploited those universal human desires and turned them into a predatory business model. The investigation also uncovered the adoption network's clients. This was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. 16 babies had been born and sold through Brener's operation between 2003 and 2019. The FBI tracked down 12 of the families who'd purchased these children. Most of them were wealthy couples who'd been unable to adopt through legal channels. Some had criminal records, others had failed psychological evaluations. A few had been explicitly denied adoption because of concerns about their fitness as parents. But here's the impossible question that the investigation raised: what do you do about those children? They were innocent. They were victims too. But they'd been living for years, some for over a decade, with the people they believed were their parents. Taking them away would create another layer of trauma. Leaving them in place meant allowing Brener's crime to stand, in a sense. The Department of Justice convened an ethics panel to address this nightmare scenario. The consensus reached was heartbreaking but pragmatic. Each case would be evaluated individually, with the child's best interest as the primary concern. Some of the younger children were removed from their adoptive families. The older ones, teenagers who'd known no other parents, were allowed to stay, with intensive therapy and support services. 4 of the 16 babies were never located. Either Brener had kept poor records, or those particular clients had been especially careful to disappear after the adoption. 4 children out there, somewhere, who would never know their true origins, or what their birth mothers had sacrificed. While victim identification and family notification proceeded, the manhunt for Thomas Brener intensified. The FBI received hundreds of tips, sightings from every corner of the globe. Brener in Argentina, Brener in Thailand, Brener in Morocco. Most were false leads, the kind you always get in high-profile cases. But in November 2019, 8 months after the bunker discovery, the FBI got a tip that actually panned out. A financial analyst working for the Department of Treasury flagged a series of transactions that matched Brener's known patterns: small, frequent withdrawals from an account in Costa Rica, always just under the reporting threshold. The account had been opened using shell company documentation, but the analyst noticed something interesting. The timing of the withdrawals corresponded with the schedule Brener had maintained when he was still in Portland. He was a creature of habit, even on the run. The FBI coordinated with Costa Rican authorities, and on November 18, 2019, a surveillance team spotted Thomas Brener at a grocery store in the beach town of Tamarindo. He'd grown a beard, dyed his hair, lost some weight, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that Dr. Cross had described, were unmistakable. Costa Rican police arrested him without incident. Brener didn't resist, didn't run. He simply set down his groceries and put his hands up. "I wondered how long it would take," were his first words after arrest. The extradition process took another 3 months. Brener fought it, of course, hiring expensive attorneys and filing motion after motion. But Costa Rica has strong extradition treaties with the United States, especially in cases involving multiple murders. By February 2020, Thomas Brener was on a plane back to Portland, shackled and silent. The trial of Thomas Brener began in September 2020, delayed slightly by the COVID-19 pandemic, but ultimately moving forward with modified courtroom procedures. It was held in the U.S. District Court for the District of Oregon, with Judge Patricia Hammond presiding. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Stone, a veteran prosecutor who'd handled complex conspiracy cases for 20 years. She knew this trial would be challenging, not because of weak evidence, but because of the sheer scope of the crimes and the disturbing nature of the details. How do you present a case like this to a jury without overwhelming them? How do you maintain their focus when you're describing systematic murder spanning 16 years? Stone's strategy was to personalize the victims. Instead of presenting them as a list of names and dates, she brought their stories to life. She had family members testify about who these women were, what they'd hoped for, what had been stolen from them. Ricardo Vega took the stand and described his sister Isabella, her dreams of helping other immigrants, her kindness, her optimism. He showed the jury photographs of Isabella as a child, as a teenager, graduating from university. He read letters she'd sent home during her first weeks in the United States, full of excitement about her work with Heritage Foundation International. "She trusted them," Ricardo said, his voice breaking. "She trusted Thomas Brener. She thought he was helping people, and he killed her for it." Maria Santos testified about her daughter Carmen, who'd been murdered in 2006. Lin Chen spoke about her sister May. Alejandro Rodriguez described his wife Sofia and the years he'd spent searching for answers while raising their son alone. The prosecution also called expert witnesses. The forensic pathologist explained how the victims had died, making it clear that this wasn't quick or painless. The preservation process had begun while the women were still alive, essentially suffocating them in chemical-soaked plastic over the course of minutes. It was torture, plain and simple. Agent David Kowalski testified about the elaborate staging with the Nazi symbols, explaining Brener's misdirection strategy. He walked the jury through photographs of the crates, showing the artificial aging, the carefully researched historical details, the deliberate deception. Thomas Brener didn't just murder these women, Kowalski told the jury. He tried to erase them from history itself. He wanted them to become anonymous victims of a different era, a different crime. He wanted to deny them even the dignity of being remembered for who they really were. And here's where the pre-intro footage became crucial to the case. Remember Marcus Chen, the urban explorer who discovered the bunker? The prosecution played his original video footage in court, the same footage that opened this story. The jury watched Marcus's camera sweep across the corridor, approach the crates, capture the moment of discovery. But Stone did something clever. She paused the video at specific moments and had forensic experts analyze what the footage revealed. "Notice here," one expert pointed out, "you can see footprints in the dust, multiple sets made at different times. Someone had been visiting this bunker regularly. And look at this corner here. See that surveillance camera? Thomas Brener had installed security cameras throughout the bunker. He was monitoring his collection." The FBI had recovered the surveillance system's hard drives during their initial investigation. The footage was damning. It showed Brener visiting the bunker more than 200 times between 2003 and 2019. In some clips, he was alone, simply walking among the crates. In others, he was accompanied by Dr. Cross or Marcus Dietrich, helping transport new victims. There was one particularly chilling piece of footage from December 2018, just 3 months before the discovery. Brener standing in front of the crates, speaking to the camera, not realizing perhaps that this footage would someday be used against him. "This is my legacy," he said in the video. 23 souls who gave their lives so that others could have better ones. The world will never understand. The world will call me a monster. But I know the truth. I created families. I gave hope. I did what was necessary. The prosecution rested after 3 weeks of testimony. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern clear, the guilt undeniable. Thomas Brener's defense team faced an impossible task. Their client had been caught, the physical evidence was irrefutable, and 3 accomplices had testified against him in exchange for plea deals. What could they possibly argue? They went with the only strategy available: diminished capacity. Brener's attorneys claimed he suffered from a delusional disorder, that he genuinely believed he was performing a humanitarian service. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about grandiose delusions, savior complexes, and moral disengagement. But here's the thing about that defense. It requires the defendant to appear delusional, and Thomas Brener was too smart, too controlled, too methodical to pull that off. When he took the stand in his own defense, against his attorney's advice, Brener came across as exactly what he was, a calculating predator who'd planned every aspect of his crimes. He spoke eloquently about his motivation, describing the adoption network as a business venture and the murders as necessary operational costs. The jury saw through it immediately. During cross-examination, Rebecca Stone destroyed any remaining sympathy Brener might have had. "Mr. Brener," she asked, "did these women consent to being surrogate mothers?" "They were compensated through housing and food," Brener replied evasively. "That's not what I asked. Did they consent?" Silence. "Did Isabella Vega consent to being impregnated?" "She signed agreements." "Did she consent to being murdered after giving birth?" "That wasn't murder. That was—" "What was it, Mr. Brener? What do you call killing a woman with potassium chloride after stealing her child?" More silence. Stone pushed harder. "You kept surveillance footage of your visits to the bunker. You maintained detailed records of each victim. You carefully planned your escape route. These aren't the actions of someone suffering from delusions, are they? These are the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and took steps to avoid getting caught." Brener's facade cracked. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "These women, they were nothing. They had nothing. No future, no prospects. I gave their children futures. I created opportunity out of 23 murders," Stone cut him off. "That's what you created, Mr. Brener, 23 murders." The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours. Guilty on all counts. 23 counts of first-degree murder, 16 counts of kidnapping, 16 counts of illegal adoption conspiracy, multiple counts of fraud, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder. When the verdict was read, Brener showed no emotion. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd known all along. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Judge Hammond listened to victim impact statements from family members. Hours of testimony about the lives that had been destroyed, the years of uncertainty, the grief that would never fully heal. Then she addressed Brener directly. "Mr. Brener," Judge Hammond said, "in my 25 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that demonstrates such calculated, sustained cruelty. You didn't kill in passion or anger. You killed as a business strategy. You saw vulnerable human beings and decided they were expendable resources to be exploited for profit. You tried to erase their very existence from history. That level of cold-blooded premeditation deserves the harshest possible consequence." Judge Hammond sentenced Thomas Brener to 23 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Even if he lived to be 200 years old, he would never walk free. But the case wasn't entirely over. The accomplices still needed to be sentenced. Dr. Martin Cross received 25 years for his role in the murders. At 72 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. He died in federal prison in 2022 from complications of heart disease. Jennifer Walsh received 15 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder charges. She's currently serving her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Victorville, California, with a projected release date in 2032. Marcus Dietrich received 18 years. His military service and cooperation with investigators earned him some leniency, but not much. He testified at trial that he regrets his role every day, that he should have stopped it, that he let money and manipulation override his conscience. The 4 individuals who remain at large, other clients in Brener's adoption network who haven't been identified, are still wanted by the FBI. Their photographs and information have been distributed to adoption agencies and child welfare organizations worldwide. Someday, they'll likely be found. Justice has a long memory. The aftermath of the Brener case rippled through multiple communities and institutions. For the families of the victims, the discovery brought a bittersweet resolution. They finally had answers about what had happened to their loved ones. They could bring their daughters, sisters, wives home for proper burial. They could grieve with certainty instead of living in endless uncertainty. Ricardo Vega established the Isabella Vega Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping families search for missing immigrants and providing legal support for vulnerable people navigating the U.S. immigration system. The foundation has helped locate 17 missing persons since its inception in 2020 and has provided pro bono legal services to hundreds of immigrant families. Maria Santos and Lin Chen joined forces to advocate for stronger regulations, governing private adoption agencies, and stricter oversight of nonprofits serving immigrant communities. Their testimony before Congress in 2021 helped pass the Safe Haven Immigration Services Act, which requires regular audits of organizations receiving federal grants for immigrant services. The 12 adopted children who were located face ongoing challenges. Some have been reunited with their biological families, extended family members of the murdered mothers who'd been searching for years. Others remain in complex legal situations, with courts trying to balance biological rights against the children's established bonds with the people who raised them. Heritage Foundation International's office building in Portland now houses a memorial to the 23 victims. Their photographs line a wall, accompanied by brief biographies celebrating who they were, not how they died. The memorial includes this inscription: "They came seeking hope, safety, and a better future. Their dreams were stolen, but their memory endures. May we never forget them or the vulnerability they represent." Marcus Chen, the urban explorer whose discovery broke the case open, struggled with PTSD after his experience. He eventually left urban exploration entirely and now works as a volunteer coordinator for victim support services in Portland. He's never gone back underground since that day in March 2019. Detective Sarah Morrison and Agent David Kowalski both received commendations for their work on the case. Morrison has since retired from the Portland Police Bureau and teaches criminal justice at Portland State University. Kowalski remains with the FBI, now focusing on cold case investigations, and has helped close 17 additional cases using techniques developed during the Brener investigation. The bunker itself was sealed permanently after the investigation concluded. The entrance was filled with concrete, and the industrial building above it was demolished as originally scheduled. That space beneath Portland is now a tomb, not for Brener's victims, who have been laid to rest properly by their families, but for his legacy. Thomas Brener, now 68 years old, is serving his sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, a maximum security facility known for housing the country's most dangerous criminals. He spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. He's appealed his conviction twice. Both appeals were denied. In a final ironic twist, Brener's property empire, the buildings, the land, the assets he'd accumulated through decades of both legitimate business and criminal proceeds, was liquidated through asset forfeiture. The proceeds, totaling over $18 million, were distributed to the victims' families and to organizations supporting immigrant rights. The bunker case, as it came to be known, fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases involving immigrants. No longer are these disappearances dismissed as voluntary departures. Task forces across the country now specifically track missing immigrants, and nonprofit organizations serving these communities face regular oversight. But perhaps the most important change is cultural. The Brener case forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth: that vulnerability is exploitable, that systems designed to help can be weaponized to harm, and that the most invisible members of society are often at the greatest risk. Thomas Brener was convicted on 23 counts of first-degree murder, 16 counts of kidnapping of adults, 16 counts of illegal adoption conspiracy, 12 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of human trafficking, 6 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and racketeering. He received 23 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 450 years for the non-murder charges. He will never be eligible for release. Isabella Vega was 23 years old when she died. She loved poetry and wanted to be a teacher. She sent letters home to her family every week during her first month in the United States, describing the beautiful Oregon rain and the kindness of strangers. Carmen Santos was 27. She'd been a nurse in Guatemala and wanted to continue her career in America. She died trying to help people. Marcus Chen was 19, the youngest victim. She'd just graduated from high school and dreamed of studying medicine. She never got the chance. Sofia Rodriguez was 31, a mother who'd made the agonizing decision to leave her 6-year-old son temporarily while she established a foothold in America. She planned to bring him over within a year. She never came home. These weren't just names on metal tags in a dark bunker. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. They were human beings who deserved better than what Thomas Brener gave them. They deserved to be remembered, not as victims of a twisted criminal enterprise, but as people who had dreams, who had hope, who had futures that were stolen from them. Their names are etched in the memorial in Portland. Their families carry their memories forward, and their stories serve as a reminder that we must never forget the vulnerable among us, never dismiss their disappearances as unimportant, never allow someone's lack of legal status or social connection to mean their life doesn't matter. May they rest in peace. And may their memory be a blessing and a call to action.